the
think,
Game
right?
Boy,
Yeah.
which was launched the same month on July 31st. Nintendo's big, or second handheld system after the Game & Watch series.
Right, right. Yeah, I mean, it was a really awesome piece of hardware at the time. You look at it today, and it's kind of like quaint and it's weird.
Was it an awesome piece of hardware though? Because for me, it was always funny. I worked at Babbage's at the time, and it was funny to me because we had the Lynx in around the same time. I think Lynx came out a few months after the Game Boy. But you're talking about this full color screen that just looked amazing. Like you had games that were almost as good as what you're getting on consoles in your hand, and the Game Boy was still this black and white, you know, blocky system. The price point. I think the price point really sold it, right? I think it was about $90 when it first came out.
And just the form factor too, like the fact that it was that small. Because for me, it was like that was the first, I guess, video game thing I owned. Like long before we had anything in my house, and my grandma bought a Game Boy just to play Tetris, and then I'd like after a couple of years, it like sat in a drawer. So like then I started.
She bought it for herself to play Tetris.
Yeah,
that's
well,
awesome.
That's the thing, right? I think a lot of the things that sold Game Boy too was Tetris. I mean, Tetris was what Game Boy.
I can't
was all
even.
about.
There's no way for me to even quantify how much Tetris I must have played as a kid, because that was just like back of the car or like doing anything. It was just like I was on a Game Boy playing
Tetris was back in the day what Angry Birds is now, where it's like it's a game that's like everywhere. If you owned anything, eventually Tetris showed up on it at some point.
My microwave,
but the Game Boy was, I think, a lot of people's first exposure to it. And what was great about the handheld was you didn't need to get somebody in front of a TV to try it out. You could literally go to your mom or your grandma and just say, "Here, try this." And that was the only barrier to entry, is you actually handing it to
batteries. I used to carry a huge thing just filled with batteries with me on like every trip we went on, because I just like knew I would play until it
That's
died.
good for self-defense too, if you have just like a filled case full of batteries.
I was a really tough 6-year-old.
So was the Game Boy. It was solid. I mean, it was a brick, right?
Yeah, that's what I mean when I say it's an amazing piece of hardware. You could drop that thing down the stairs and you're fine.
I used to play like on the beach. Like if my family went on family vacations, I just didn't do anything but sit there and play Game Boy. And it's like funny because it like went through like water damage, and I would drop it all the time, and it was like thrown in my backpack and like stuck under my bed, and like it was always fine.
There's that famous Game Boy that was like burned in the Iraq War for those soldier had, and it still works.
Yeah, it's in the Nintendo World Store in New York. They still have it on display. They have it like plugged in and stuff. It's cool.
Yeah. Now I had been a gamer for over a decade by the time the Game Boy came out. And I don't think anybody in my family really cared about games until they saw the Game Boy. And again, Tetris was the thing that kind of got them interested in that, because it was a concept they could understand. You know, it was a little bit simpler.
It's abstract, it's puzzly, it's not like elves or aliens. Like there's no sort of self-consciousness about that.
And that's when they, my family actually were kind of interested in what my hobby was.
Yeah. It was so tied to the platform too. Like for me, like, and again, I was like a little kid, so I was dumb. But it's like I didn't realize that was anything other than a Tetris machine for like years. And then like when I got like Wario Land or something like way later, and it blew my mind that you could like put other games into.
You're like, Dad, there's a new Game Boy. It plays Wario.
Exactly.
I mean, you're talking about like one of the best-selling systems of all time.
119 million units sold, including the Game Boy Pocket and Game Boy Color.
Yeah.
Wow.
Same family.
It was one of those systems at my house where like people were fighting over could I play it. My mom, my sister, and me. It was like, whenever that thing sat idle, somebody grabbed it.
The combination of it being portable and having Tetris got a lot of adults playing video games that hadn't been playing games, the whole decade prior.
Well, like Tal was saying, the barrier to entry was just really low. Like it was just an easily like $90 is like not like pocket change or anything, but it's like.
I think the other systems. I think Game Gear came out the next year, and I think even that was maybe the lowest cost one. I think even that was like 150. So you're talking almost twice the price of what you're getting for the.
Did Game Gear really come out in 1990?
I think so. We'll talk about that in the 1990s.
Wait till next year's discussion. Yeah, spoilers.
But the Lynx was out in '89, because I remember having them both in the store, and I was maybe 16 then when I was.
You talk about some of the other contenders, like Game Boy's still a brand. Like that's the one that's still around,
Yeah.
Well, Micro was the last one, right?
Yeah.
That sort of counts.
They officially discontinued the Game Boy line in like 2005, I think.
Well, at first it was
about a run, Yeah.
Yeah. Exactly.
But I mean, the point being, like, very obviously that led to the DS. Like, very obviously that is like a line they've continued. And even it's funny because like looking at like the 2DS now, it's like that obviously traces its roots back to the Game Boy. It's actually really interesting that like Nintendo. I don't know, like, I think this obviously began that, like, in the middle of that console era, in the middle of the NES being so popular, this started a whole other very important part of their business.
Yeah. I think it's an example of Nintendo really being a leader, because they dominated in the 80s home console area so significantly. Like, they didn't need to create a handheld device, but they did. And it was a huge success.
You could also consider, and there were so many people who had them too, you could multiplayer game, you had to use a cable.
Yeah.
You didn't have Wi-Fi back then.
No. But I totally used the link cable to play Tetris against friends. For sure. Created by Gunpei Yokoi, Nintendo Research and Development 1, the same staff who had designed the Game & Watch, and it stuck. I think it was significant that it stuck with the exact same controls as the NES, just the D-pad and the A/B buttons.
Which makes it super easy for developers when they've got a game that works on one platform. They don't have to really think a lot about how that would translate over to a different control scheme.
It's also interesting that it came with headphones, because I don't think the DS or the Vita comes with
I don't
headphones.
think anything comes with headphones, yeah.
No, just your iPhones.
For a long time, you couldn't even get an HDMI cable with a console.
So, you know, we're talking about the design and the build of that. I mean, it looked a lot like an NES too, right? Like it came out, it looked almost like a little shrunk NES with a screen built right into it.
It wasn't shrunk that much,
Right,
actually.
yeah. So, you know, they carried over, you know, that the gray casing, and it kind of had that same cube, blocky look to it. It was very good in keeping kind of their brand design going on too.
Yeah, I think by virtue of being mine, I have probably more fond memories with the Game Boy than with the NES, because I never actually owned my own NES. It's a tough childhood. It's just rough.
You're an inspiration.
We're going to start a fundraising, like a charity relief program for you right after this.
To be fair, you were what, 5 by the time the SNES came out, so
Yeah, probably.
you probably moved right into that era pretty
Launch games were Super Mario Land, Alleyway, Baseball, Tetris, and Tennis. So 3 sort of generic sports games. I liked Alleyway a lot myself. That was like a breakout Arkanoid type game.
Of those, though, it's pretty easy to understand why Tetris was such the blockbuster
for sure.
hit early on, right? I mean, that really, I think, was the most captivating of those
Yeah,
titles.
and Super Mario Land is kind of a weird Mario game.
Yeah.
There's a lot of weird stuff. He like flies a plane in it at one point.
Yeah, I forgot about that.
And the blurry screen made it a little bit difficult to play a platform like that at that time. Yeah.
That was the one thing, as durable as that thing is, the screen like faded after a while, and it was just impossible to even see what you were doing.
It almost looked like an Etch-a-Sketch.
Yeah, and like some games tried to use like gradient effects almost, like there would be like lighter things, it would just be a disaster. Disaster, Steve.
Other notable Game Boy games, the Game Boy gave us Pokemon.
Yeah.
Yeah?
Oh my god.
Right?
Spent so much time with Pokemon.
The Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening is some people's favorite Legend of Zelda game.
That's too bad for them, but okay.
They reimagined Donkey Kong on the Game Boy, and it's incredible. It's amazing. It's not just like a remake of the original Donkey Kong. It's a totally different like puzzle game. And then they had the Final Fantasy Legends series. I think there were like 3 of them on Game Boy, and that was, I believe, the first really portable RPG series. It's pretty interesting.